He's all over bar the shouting. The fat lady isn't so much gargling as doing her warm-up exercises. Donald Trump has declared victory, and nobody, I suppose this is a silver lining of sorts, nobody is likely to accuse him of lying, the election of being rigged, or indeed to launch an attempted insurrection upon the seat of American government. Quite a lot of questions coming in that I can't answer. I don't know what happens to all the court cases, Kenneth, but I suspect that they are, to all intents and purposes, over. I think on days like today, you let me just chat a bit, and then we'll work out what the conversation is going to sound like, stuff that I want to try and puzzle out, stuff perhaps I want to get off my chest. I've written down 3 words, and I bet you can't, for the life of you, work out why or what links them. I've written down Dixville, Marks, and Mateless. Dixville, Marks, and Mateless. And the combination of those 3 things explains why when I turned to the news this morning, first thing actually, earlier than I usually do, 7 o'clock in the morning, being my kickoff point. And indeed when I turned to the news this morning, I felt that familiar sinking feeling, but I didn't feel the seismic shock that seems to have accompanied some responses to Donald Trump's victory. I had a small bet on Kamala Harris, and the odds last night were the same as what they were when I placed it a long time ago. And all of the odds, if you follow betting markets, were pointing towards a Trump victory. So I was a little surprised at some of the certainty, particularly from people who are normally quite good at this sort of thing. Some of the certainty, not only that Kamala Harris would win, but also that she would win by a country mile. So Dixville, Marks, and Mateless. Let's start with Mateless, who did sterling work last night across all manner of platforms. But I don't know if you remember, was it a year ago when Emily went to America to sort of test the waters when everybody presumed that 2024 would be Biden versus Trump? Emily went to America and sought to establish, the lie of the land, electorally speaking. And I was taken aback, actually. I don't think I conveyed it on air. But I was really surprised by the first thing she said to me, which is that the main topic of conversation, or the thing that people seem to care most about, was the price of petrol, or gasoline, as they call it, at the pumps. Now, that was interesting for a number of reasons, but chiefly because for people like me, and possibly you, who presume that little things like trying to launch an insurrection against a democratically elected government, being found by a court essentially to be a rapist, or being a multiple felon. All of these things that I thought, and you possibly thought, or would have thought, would overshadow everything else. I'm fond of the phrase, as you know, personal depravity. The idea that Donald Trump's personal depravity would push all other concerns out of the electoral space, out of the political space. I don't care what he says you would think about the economy or about immigration or about any of the other issues that purport to be priorities in politics, because his personal depravity is so acute and so obvious that it won't matter. So that's mistake number 1. It is about the price of petrol at the pumps. People are looking at their personal financial situation and believing the man who said he will make it better. What you have in your pocket and the spending power you have in the store is not about GDP. It's partly about inflation, and that's where the first, if you like, a tragedy kicks in that the performance on inflation has been better than most in the world, but not good enough to diffuse the sense across much of America that they are worse off under Joe Biden than they were under Trump. So this notion that liberals, I don't think, can let go of. I don't think you can say personal depravity doesn't matter. I don't think you can say we need to prepare ourselves for a new political age in which personal depravity doesn't matter. Daniel Finkelstein in the Times today writes quite brilliantly, and he wrote before the results landed, so it gave him a sort of freedom, if you like, to speak without the bias of knowledge. Indeed, he acknowledged this himself. He said, "I have an advantage over you. You are reading this knowing at least something of the presidential election result. I am writing before the votes have been counted." It's one of the most acute pieces of political analysis that I think I've ever read. And it runs through all of the things that we have run through on this programme. It points out that he has remained politically viable through a series of quite extraordinary scandals, multiple felonies, found by a court to have raped a woman, disowned by his former vice president and his former national security advisor, called a fascist by his former chief of staff, and described by his former military chief as the most dangerous person ever. So when you get your little pound shop Trumpites in the Conservative Party like Suella Braverman claiming that the nomenclature of fascism, that the accusations of being like Hitler have come from the left, they're lying to you again, just like they did when they told you Liz Truss would be a brilliant prime minister, or when they told you Boris Johnson was an honest man, or when they told you that Brexit would be brilliant. They're lying to you again. The queue of people describing Donald Trump in fascistic and hideous terms consisted largely, for the final months of the campaign, of people who had once been in his inner circle. Not just people who'd once voted for him and regretted it, but people who had once been in his inner circle. His own vice president, his own national security advisor, his own former chief of staff, and his former military chief described him, and I quote, as the most dangerous person ever. And as Daniel Finkelstein writes, barely touches the sides of all the scandals he's been embroiled in and all of the staff members who have sounded the alarm about him. And Liberals have to cling to the notion that this matters. You can't let go of the idea that this stuff doesn't matter just because it seems not to matter to a majority of the American electorate. I think he's probably going to win the popular vote for the first time, looking at how things stand. So that is why I was haunted almost, and conscious perhaps of not having paid as much heed to it at the time as I should have done, of how precise it was of Emily Maitlis to point out, I think a year ago, from America, on a mission to find out how the land lay electorally, that people were really concerned about the price of petrol at the pumps. Isn't that incredible? The second thing I wrote down was Dixville. This is why I went to bed last night thinking Donald Trump was going to win. Dixville Notch in, I think, New Hampshire has one of those wonderful political traditions, one of those, it's almost a pub quiz question, where they declare first. There are only 6 people in the village, but they declare first. So historically, the first result you get comes from Dixville Notch, New Hampshire. I had never heard of it before. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I'm good, but I'm not that good. And my friend James Ball, who is a political anorak, was following it very closely. And he pointed out shortly after their declaration that it had gone exactly 50-50. And 6 people live in a village. 50% of them, 3 of them voted for Kamala Harris, 3 of them voted for Donald Trump. And that's almost a sitcom pilot waiting to happen, isn't it? What would life be like in that village? But what was really interesting about it was that in 2020, it was 100% Joe Biden. So in 2020, 6 people voted for Joe Biden and no people voted for Donald Trump. Fast forward 2024, it's 50-50. And that is the nugget that we have failed. That's the oyster we've failed to prise open on this program. The existence, the motivation of people who could move from one to the other, which you find almost unthinkable because you think that all that stuff matters. All that stuff about rape, all that stuff about felonies, all that stuff about national security advisors and military chiefs and former vice presidents. You presume it matters to the point where it crowds out all other concerns. Spoiler alert, it really doesn't. You can conclude, if you must, that a majority of the American electorate today, it was the same 6 people as well, Bruce, which I thought fascinating because 3 of them can make that extraordinary move, a move that remains possibly unthinkable to many of us. But one of the most influential commentators in America, Joe Rogan, whose podcast reaches parts that traditional media can only dream of, has been on an almost identical journey. Quite extraordinary to reflect upon things he said about Barack Obama. Well, I'm going to play it to you, actually. I've never played any Joe Rogan. Reuters did a thing recently that found he was by far the most influential political commentator in America online. You'll never guess who the UK equivalent was. I'll give you a clue. He has a fraction of the traction that Joe Rogan enjoys, but I'm doing my best. And so you get that notion that it doesn't matter. It doesn't crowd out the scandal. It doesn't crowd out the crime. It doesn't even crowd out the sex offending. So what's the third thing? And you're going to have to allow me, because my inner schoolboy is never far from the service. You're going to have to allow me to say that was quite the swing in Dixville. But the third element of the conversation is the thing that Simon Marks and I touched upon at the end of yesterday's programme, which was, in many ways, it kind of stayed with me on the way home. I nearly inserted a caveat while we were talking about it, but I didn't, because it was true. And it's the weirdest element, perhaps, of all. So Simon and I yesterday concluded that in many ways, and you need to listen to the end of this, because at first glance it might seem very, very strange. In many ways, the worst thing that could happen in yesterday's election, if you were to step back and try to focus on the biggest picture of all, the worst thing that could happen would be a very narrow victory for Kamala Harris. Because that would, as many people feared and predicted, that would propel January the 6th Mark II. That would propel another attempted insurrection, and probably it would make the last January the 6th look like a dress rehearsal. And this is the bit I find weirdest. That didn't overcome all of the other issues either. So even that fear, which you talk about now, Simon and I talked about it so casually, so sort of normally. Well, of course, the big fear is that if Kamala Harris wins by a narrow margin, he'll probably attempt another coup, and this time he might succeed. And we talk about that so blithely, so casually. Could you imagine 10 years ago, two relatively qualified or informed commentators or watchers of politics on either side of the Atlantic? Could you imagine two people talking about avoiding the possibility of an attempted coup being a very real factor in election analysis? And just casually saying to each other, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? I suppose that's a silver. So we actually said the best result would be a clear victory for either candidate. I don't know that a clear victory, a narrow victory for Trump wouldn't have changed anything. We'd be exactly where we are today. There is no prospect whatsoever of Kamala Harris announcing that she intends to ignore the election result or telling lies about votes. I mean, again, this weird narrative of relating facts in the context of an election result that says these facts don't matter to enough people. This is relatively uncharted territory. Even with Brexit, the realisation that you'd been lied to was on the road ahead. The naive belief that facts would matter, that they would overcome feelings, that was all on the horizon. You're not going to get richer. There's not going to be 350 million quid for the NHS. They're not going to suddenly start deporting every brown person on the tills in Tesco's. They're not. All of that stuff that propelled Brexit over the line was an extraordinary con trick. But this is all in the rearview mirror, and it doesn't matter. And this is what you have to cling to. It doesn't matter enough. It doesn't matter enough. The fact that he tried to steal the last election, the fact that he was prepared to subvert the entire democratic process up to and including the potential assault upon his own vice president, the disowning of his most senior former colleagues, the condemnation of his former military chief, the use of the F word by his former chief of staff, the condemnation from his own national security advisor. None of it mattered. Brackets enough. And that is why I think we've struggled in the last couple of weeks, whenever we've turned our attention to this American election, to get to the bottom of it. I think we got closest yesterday. I thought that the question of what is it about America that we don't understand was the closest we got to acknowledging that there's something going on that turns a lot of our presumptions upside down. One thing, for example, and this has resonance in some elements of British politics. If you're a second or third generation immigrant in America, you are not going to be necessarily any more casual towards the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Donald Trump than you are if you can trace your lineage back to the Mayflower. If you are prioritizing your personal financial health over everything else, and someone is telling you that your personal financial health is being compromised by immigration, most obviously illegal, but of course it's always a very, very short hop to legal immigration, getting hit with the same attack lines, then you're not going to think, well, my granddad was an immigrant. You're not even going to think my dad was an immigrant. Just look at some of the people who have risen in the Conservative Party in recent years. You're going to think, well, actually, no, they're a threat to me as well. So those three things, I still can't quite unravel or riddle. So the Dixville thing is easy. That was me naively thinking, oh, well, the game's up. If three people can shift out of six, if 50% of a tiny and probably unrepresentative electorate can make such a huge leap from pro-Biden to pro-Trump, then I think the game is up for Kamala Harris. Mateless telling me a year ago that the priority for many of the people she was talking to was the price of petrol at the pumps. I don't want to describe liberal discombobulations about things like rape and election theft. I don't want to describe that as a luxury, but it's clear that for a majority of the American election, none of this matters enough. It doesn't matter enough. It's dispiriting but grimly predictable that people like Suella Braverman can share their views on this without being asked questions about things like rape and election theft, and can say things about the left describing him as a fascist when in fact it was his own national security advisor. But that's a failure of media in this country that has been in place since long before 2016. But the electorate don't care enough about these things to overshadow or overcome their fears, I think, first about the economy and second about immigration. But I don't think you can separate those two things. If you know, you've seen it happen here. Don't look up, look down. The reason why your financial situation is not as healthy as you would like it to be is because of the people that mow your lawn and deliver your food. It's not because of the people who run the country or the people that own Twitter or the people that own Amazon. It's because of him over there delivering your tacos. Little nod to my American listeners there. And that is where I am at 21 minutes after 10 this morning. Very, very simply, none of the stuff matters enough. And that is why, look, Daniel Finkelstein is a conservative member of the House of Lords, the founder of one of the think tanks that became a kind of madrasa for conservative politicians, a very close ally of David Cameron and George Osborne, a key part of the process that propelled them to the very forefront of the Conservative Party. Therefore, he is someone with whom I would hardly ever disagree. And yet, I beg your pardon, hardly ever agree. And yet, the point he makes is, I think, inarguable. An alarming number of people don't care at all about liberal democratic norms, as long as things are all right for them, or as long as they think that the person trashing liberal democratic norms is going to be good for them, has their interests at heart. Whether that's true or not is immaterial. It's moot, isn't it? I'll read that to you again. An alarming number of people don't care at all about liberal democratic norms as long as things are all right for them. And they rather think, quotes, strongman, end quotes, rule. Personal note, the weirdest thing about Donald Trump support is the notion that he's some sort of strongman when he's an incredibly thin-skinned man-child. But maybe all strongmen through history were. They just had good PR. They think that this strongman rule might be better than rule by a load of squabbling politicians. They like that Trump or they believe that Trump is a successful and ruthless businessman. They like that he belittles other people. They think he's doing it on their behalf. And I won't share with you yet Finkelstein's evidence that this applies in the UK as well, because I need to get a phone-in up and running. Well, I think I do. You know me. It's one of those days. I'd quite happily talk uninterrupted until 12 noon today, but I don't know that that's necessarily what you've tuned in for. Some of you tell me that you have, and that's very kind, but we need to puzzle this stuff together. So I don't think you can argue with that conclusion. An alarming number of people, enough people to elect a president, don't care at all about liberal democratic norms. As long as, and then you can insert whatever sentence you want here to take you back to where this introduction began, as long as it brings down the price of petrol. As long as it improves my spending power in Walmart. As long as it makes me feel better about myself. An alarming number of people, a majority probably of the popular vote in America, do not care at all about liberal democratic norms, as long as things are all right for them. And remember, this article, which I heartily recommend, was written before the results came in. I'll give you one statistic. This is from a bit of polling that was done for a British think tank. Support for a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections was at 46%. So we're living in a world where enough people to deliver election victories do not care, actively reject liberal democratic norms. Eleanor's just written the word time in 6-inch high letters on the screen in front of me, which I think is a fair comment. Time, gentlemen, please. So what do we do about that? Well, I mean, what do we do about that? If you don't care about liberal democratic norms, I see you. I know you. You're tuning in to hear me have a breakdown or to feast on my liberal tears. But for those of us who do care, what do we do with the news? What do we do with the discovery that most Americans don't?